Our speaker of today is Dharmananda Kosambi Memorial Lecture, Dr. Mangesh Kulkarni, and the Honorary Secretary of the Institute, Professor Bahulkar. As I told you some time ago, the program was scheduled to be held at the Tata Hall, but due to some technical problem, we shifted it to our small conference room, and we were not aware of this overwhelming response to the lecture. And then we are here. This is our new auditorium named as the Nawalbal Firodia Auditorium, opened only on the occasion of Dasara. So I request Professor Bahulkar, the Honorary Secretary, to introduce the speaker as well as Dharmananda Kosambi, in whose name the lecture series is named.
Friends, it gives me great pleasure to be with you this evening on the occasion of Dr. Dharmananda Kosambi Memorial Lecture. This lecture series is one of the important lecture series of the Institute. We have about 14 to 15 memorial lecture series on a variety of subjects. Predominantly the topics related to Indology, Indian philosophy, Sanskrit, Prakrit and Pali languages and so on. As we know, Dharmananda Kosambi was a great scholar of Buddhism, a practitioner of Buddhism, and a scholar of Pali language and literature. He was interested in Buddhism right from his young age, and therefore he visited Sri Lanka, where he became a monk, and with Mahasthavira Sumangalacharya he started studying Pali. Then he made a tour to Buddhist places, Buddhist sites in India, and then abandoning his nomadic life, he decided to write books on Buddhism and popularize Buddhism. In those days, the language Pali was not a part of curriculum of the universities. Dharmananda Kosambi was a pioneer of Pali studies. He taught Pali at several places, including Ferguson College, and taught a number of students. Many of his students became great scholars of Pali language and literature and Buddhism. For example, Dr. P.V. Bapat, who was closely associated with this institute, and he was assigned a very important work of editing a volume, 2500 Years of Buddhism, on the occasion of the completion of 2500 years of the Mahaparinirvana of the Buddha. Others were N.K. Bhagavat, C.V. Rajwade, and also C.V. Joshi, Chimvi Joshi, as we know him. And people do not know that he was a scholar of Pali, a professor of Pali, and also wrote a reader. He composed a reader in Pali language, which has nothing to do with his humorous attitude and literature. Dharmananda Kosambi also taught at several places in Gujarat Vidyapeeth, and also he was associated with Harvard University, where he worked with Professor Woods and edited a very important work in Pali, Buddhaghosa's Visuddhimagga. It's a long story about his association with Harvard University. He visited that university about 3 times and worked rigorously on that text with Professor Woods. He also wrote a number of books. For example, his work Bhagavan Buddha, Part 1 and 2, and then Buddha Dharma and Sangha. He wrote in Marathi and also in Gujarati. Hindi, Sanskriti wa Ahimsa. All his books are very interesting, and he had his own way of thinking. He was not dogmatic. He did not accept just something just because it is written in Pali or it was supposed to be the Buddha Vachana. He also wrote a play called Bodhisattva Nataka in Marathi, where he interpreted the life of the Buddha in a different way, different from whatever has been mentioned in Pali literature. For example, he did not believe that the Buddha at the age of 29 did not see any old man, did not know the death, or did not see a dead person, and so on. So that was not the reason for his abandoning home. The probable reason was, as he mentioned, that the struggle, the conflict between the two clans, Shakyas and Koliyas, and Dr. Ambedkar liked this idea and he also interpreted in the same way. And as we can see, if you read closely Dr. Ambedkar's The Buddha and his Dhamma, you will find that some of his ideas have already been mentioned by Dharmananda Kosambi. Of course, Dr. Ambedkar, he offered his own interpretation to Buddhism, which was somewhat different from Dharmananda Kosambi. Kosambi was also interested in Jainism, and lately he was perhaps influenced by Jainism, and he left his mortal body by accepting Santhara, Sallekhana. So we are very happy to arrange this lecture in the sacred memory of Dharmananda Kosambi. Today's speaker, Dr. Mangesh Kulkarni, he has taught political science over the last 3 decades. But he is not just a scholar of political science, he is a scholar of philosophy, sociology, and also Western philosophy and Buddhism. He currently teaches courses on political theory and thought to MA students and guides MPhil and PhD students at the Department of Politics and Public Administration of Savitribai Phule Pune University. He has also taught and done research at universities in Zomba, Göttingen in Germany, Vienna, Austria, and Leipzig in Germany. Dr. Kulkarni has published numerous articles and reviews in national and international journals like the Economic and Political Weekly, Vasi, South Asia Bulletin, India Review, the Australian Journal of Anthropology, and besides, he has the following books to his credit: A Terrorist of the Spirit, India in World Affairs, Politics in Maharashtra, Interdisciplinary Perspectives in Political Theory, and a recent one, Global Masculinities. Dr. Kulkarni was in the editorial team of New Quest, an interdisciplinary journal based in Mumbai, Paramarsha, a Marathi journal of philosophy published by the University of Pune, and Shodharthi, a Hindi journal of political studies, New Delhi, as well as an international advisory editor of the Sage journal, Men and Masculinities. He served as an honorary joint secretary at the Asiatic Society of Mumbai during 2003 to 2005. He has received a Rotary International grant for university teachers to serve in developing countries, the Indal Fellowship of the Asiatic Society of Bombay, a research grant of the Rockefeller Archive Center in New York, and an Erasmus Mundus scholarship of the European Commission. In 2011, Dr. Kulkarni served as the first ICCR visiting chair professor of Indian Studies at the University of Vienna. He was a guest fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies Shimla during summer 2013. And in 2017, just recently, he served as the ICCR visiting chair professor of Indian Studies at Leipzig University, Germany. I welcome Dr. Kulkarni and request him to begin his lecture.
Thank you, Professor Bahulkar. And whatever he has said so far has already given you enough of an indication that I am something of a grasshopper and an amateur, a professional amateur, if you like. Somebody once described me a person as a professional idiot. So similarly, I'm a professional amateur. So therefore, I hope you'll just bear with me, because this is a topic which I have chosen, and to address it adequately would require, scholarship of an altogether different order, a kind of scholarship that I will not be able to master in this lifetime. But I thought I would just open this area up for discussion and perhaps further investigation. And other people have already worked on it, no doubt, but I thought perhaps in India people haven't looked at it so much. And I think that the reason why Professor Bahulkar has invited me here mainly is this, that, apart from, we know about his erudition and so on, but he's also a very witty person and also a benevolent person. And it was an admixture of benevolence and humor, I think, which has led him to invite me, because I often attend programs here and, participate in discussions, etc. So he probably just threw down this gauntlet to me, as it were, and I picked it up. Okay, so now, really to speak in at a forum and in memory of forum like this, and memory of a person like Acharya Dharmanand Kosambi, it's really a daunting task. I mean, I remember I recently once again had a look at this collection of the writings of Acharya Dharmanand Kosambi. That is actually, these are translations from the Marathi. And this was published by his granddaughter, Meera Kosambi, some years ago. And there she dedicates the book actually to the memory of her grandfather, Dharmanand Kosambi, and her father, the famous scholar, polymath scholar, D.D. Damodar Kosambi. Both of them are actually D.D. Kosambis. But anyway. So, and there she says, I bear this name, Kosambi, proudly, but not lightly. So even to be able to, I mean, even on one particular evening, on a particular occasion, to be associated with that name, I mean, it's not something that one should do lightly, and I'm very aware of it. Having said that, now the next thing is, of course, the theme of that of this particular lecture is obviously related to an area in which Dharmanand Kosambi, of course, was in which he was deeply involved, in which he did pioneering work and so on. And it would have been a very nice coincidence if he had also written something about Nietzsche, but to my knowledge, he has not. And perhaps he has written about Nietzsche and I have not noticed it. And I remember years, as far as his work is, my familiarity or acquaintance with Dharmanand Kosambi's work is concerned, that goes back several years, when I discovered his Marathi books on Buddhism in my grandfather's collection, and I've read some of them. And recently I once again had a look at Meeratai's edited volume, but I do not have very close acquaintance with his work. I'm fully aware of the kind of pioneering work that he did in Buddhism, and I know that what he referred to, for example, that Dr. Ambedkar derived many of his ideas from Dharmananda. This is now very, very well recognized. So here goes. Now I'll begin with the rationale, the sort of reasons that have led me to the choice of this particular topic. And I've given 3 sets of reasons. One of them actually I've already mentioned, the last one. The first is that, of course, Nietzsche remains very significant even today, and his legacy, his philosophical legacy, bulked large in the intellectual landscape of the last century, and you find a range of thinkers, especially in the post-Second World War era, like the existentialists, then the post-structuralists. They picked up his ideas and developed them, and then wove them into their different kinds of philosophical narratives. And to mention just one name, I think a thinker whose ideas are very relevant today and are actually used by scholars across disciplines, that's Michel Foucault, for example, I think drew in a very major way on the work and the insights of Nietzsche. So Nietzsche, this is of intrinsic interest, anything to do with Nietzsche. And then also, of course, because Nietzsche himself showed a considerable interest in Buddhism. Otherwise, there would be no sense in just bringing together 2 different streams of thought, if there were no kind of dialogue between them at all, though even that can be attempted. But in this case, Nietzsche, like his great predecessors Hegel and Schopenhauer, he had a serious interest in and an engagement with Buddhism. So that is the second reason why I have chosen this theme. And the third reason I have already mentioned, which is that I thought this would be a good way of commemorating Acharya Dharmananda Kosambi and also his lifelong dedication to Buddhist studies. Now, coming to the structure of this particular lecture, and I would like it not to be long, so because we already started a little late, so let me spell out the structure. It is a kind of loose, jointed, tripartite structure, and the kind of questions that it grapples with are of the following kind. One question is, what led Nietzsche to a critical engagement with Buddhism? Because it was not often that philosophers, European philosophers, then engaged with non-European streams of thought. And even today, they don't really. And great mainstream European philosophers, take a figure like, he's still alive actually, and intellectually also active as far as I know, Habermas, Jürgen Habermas, for example, from Nietzsche's own country. I wonder what is his level of engagement with non-European or non-Western thought. So, therefore, it would be good to see what led Nietzsche to Buddhism. Then, secondly, a related question is, what does his interpretation of Buddhism tell us about Nietzsche's own worldview? Does it tell us something about his own philosophy, or was this something that is just a minor episode in Nietzsche's intellectual journey? And I don't think it was just a minor episode. And then second question that I want to raise is, and here I am on really very tricky ground, but I thought it was at least a question worth posing. That is, does the Nietzschean critique of Buddhism, does it at all provide an insight into the moral psychology underlying the appeal of Buddhist practices? So anyway, even if that's not there, you can still hear me. Should I continue? Or did I step on it? I didn't realize. So that is the second kind of question that I'm trying to address. And then, thirdly, and this is an area about which I know a little bit more, which is that in what way did Indian thinkers respond to Nietzsche? Yeah, because if you look at, say, the last, not 100 years, but about 70 odd years, then you'll find some significant, Indian thinkers who did in fact respond to Nietzsche in various ways. Let me, for example, point out that there are some interesting references to Nietzsche in the work of Sri Aurobindo, for example. But more importantly, the great poet and philosopher Iqbal, for example, from what I know, he had a first-hand knowledge of Nietzsche's work. He had lived and studied in Germany. He knew the language. And if you look at his notion of khudi, which is both a philosophical notion and it's also woven into his poetry, I think that owes a debt to Nietzsche. So there were people like this, but I have chosen two thinkers from Maharashtra actually. One of them wrote almost exclusively in Marathi and the other largely in English, and they were like poles apart, so I will come to them. So those are the thinkers who I think significantly engaged with Nietzsche. And so that is the third question. So that's why I'm saying that it's a kind of a loosely jointed structure. Now, how did, what was Nietzsche's access to Buddhism? Because we just heard that, really some key Buddhist texts became really available to a wider readership, I think only about 70 odd years ago, when people like Dharmananda and so on started working on them methodically. So, how is it that a German thinker in the late 19th century, how did he access Buddhism at all? So that's one question. Now we have to, of course, remember that Indology as a discipline was had already emerged in Germany by the time Nietzsche went to the university. In this case, actually, it happens to be Leipzig, where he was in the late 1860s, and where that his training was in what was called philology, and in fact he was a great philologist, and so of course obviously an interest in variety of languages, and he studied Sanskrit actually with Hermann Brockhaus, who I believe also taught Sanskrit to Max Müller. So he had a good training, reasonably good training in Sanskrit. Then many of you might have heard of Paul Deussen, who was a very major Indologist of that generation, of Nietzsche's generation, was Nietzsche's close friend. But it remains, still we have to accept the fact that Nietzsche's knowledge of Buddhism came from sources, translations, which were not really very good translations, or they were really not first-hand dependable sources. So this also has to be admitted. And in spite of this, I think, as I'm going to explain later, in my opinion at least, he I think did have a few really very interesting things to say about Buddhism, and he had a few really valid insights into what Buddhism was all about. But of course there were also a lot of misunderstanding. That is only to be expected. And sometimes misunderstanding can also be very productive. So this also happens. Okay. And then, of course, we know, many students of philosophy would know this, that Nietzsche owed his philosophical understanding of Buddhism to the interpretation offered by Arthur Schopenhauer, who was, of course, a major influence generally on his thinking, especially in the early years. And some of you might have read his famous essay called on Schopenhauer as educator. And we know that Schopenhauer, Buddhism played a major role in Schopenhauer's thought, and Schopenhauer projected it as a kind of a pessimistic creed, though Schopenhauer thought it was not very thoroughgoing, really, but it was a very significant kind of a pessimistic creed, and that was also Nietzsche's perception of Buddhism in some respects. So how did Nietzsche approach actually Buddhism philosophically? Now, as I just said, he was greatly influenced by Schopenhauer's foregrounding of nihilism, which is nihilism is the sort of doctrine which emphasizes the fundamental meaninglessness of existence. Now, this is, of course, a theme that has recurred in especially modern Western thought from time to time, from Schopenhauer. Then, of course, in the 1940s, you find it in existentialism, in the thought of Sartre, etc. and so on, right? What Camus called the problem of absurdity. So now, what happens with Schopenhauer is that Schopenhauer, of course, himself at one level accepts the meaninglessness of the world, and he finds an echo of that in Buddhism. And then this position leads Schopenhauer to a denial of the will and to the advocacy of a kind of rigorous asceticism. So it's in a certain sense a world denying kind of a philosophy. Though I know that all these great thinkers are open to so many different interpretations, that there would be other ways of looking at Schopenhauer perhaps. But this is one dominant interpretation of Schopenhauer. And to eventually, to Nietzsche, Schopenhauer's philosophy, Christianity, as well as Buddhism, all of them, according to Nietzsche, were world-denying, nihilist, and decadent doctrines. So he clearly overcame Schopenhauer's influence, and he struck out in a different direction. So what was that direction? What he tried to do was to replace these kind of decadent nihilist doctrines by a worldview based on a ringing affirmation of the world as it is. Okay? And this, I think, is particularly very poetically and vividly embodied in his doctrine of eternal recurrence, for example. And he emphasized not denial of the will, but the will to create, sometimes called the will to power. That will to power is a bit tricky phrase. And we know that that has been then appropriated by fascists and others, and that's something I don't want to go into right now. So I'm deliberately using the term will to create. And of course, his ideal of the overman. I'm using that term rather than Superman. So the Superman is this kind of prodigiously creative, life-affirming and prodigiously creative kind of a person. So he is, of course, somebody like Hitler would be actually a travesty of this kind of overman ideal that Nietzsche had projected. So these are some of the basic ingredients of his own thought. Now, so if you, as we've seen, Nietzsche eventually became very critical of Buddhism, and he saw it as a kind of a life-denying kind of a religion. And yet, he saw it as decadent, nihilist, all of that. And yet, it is, some people have argued, and this is just one example. Benjamin Ellman, for example, has argued that actually Nietzsche's critique of Buddhism stemmed from a misunderstanding, and that's at one level obvious, as I said, even his sources were defective and so on. But it's not just that, it is also a hermeneutic misunderstanding. That is a failure of interpretation also. But Ellman and some others have argued that there is, in fact, there are many areas of significant convergence between the Buddhist and the Nietzschean worldviews. So, what are these? Here are some examples. Both Nietzsche and Buddhism deconstruct the idea of some kind of a coherent and enduring kind of a self or ego. To Nietzsche, the ego is kind of fictive. And Nietzsche, as many of you would know, was also a great stylist. Yeah? And his writings are replete, even in translation, because we access him, I mean, people like me access him through translation. And one can see that, the brilliance of his prose and some of the scintillating kind of formulations that he comes up with. And one of them, I remember, it goes like this. He says that, what is all this talk about the soul? The soul, when we talk about the soul, it's just actually a way of talking about the body and so on. So he has, this also, as you know, the doctrine of anatta, that there is the no soul doctrine is central to Buddhism. Then also Nietzschean perspectivism, and for example, the Madhyamika Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna's contention that all statements about the world or ourselves are empty of permanence. These are also, I think, somewhat analogous. I mean, Nietzsche had a kind of a skeptical view of anything that was projected as some kind of an eternal truth and so on. And one of his other formulations that I recall at this point, and that relates to his perspectivism, he says somewhere that truths, what we call truths, are actually illusions of which we have forgotten that that's what they are. So there is a sort of a, one can posit an analogy between Nietzsche and Nagarjuna in this respect. And there is, of course, in Nietzsche as well as in Buddhism, a very principled and clear rejection of the spirit of revenge. And this is one of the many points which can be used to resist the fascist, any kind of fascist appropriation of Nietzsche. Apart from the fact that, of course, Nietzsche was not a nationalist, Nietzsche was not a racist, and so on and so forth. So now the problem with Nietzsche, of course, is that he uses a kind of rhetoric. See, and especially if you read him very literally, then you are bound to go astray. Some of the best minds, therefore, have misinterpreted Nietzsche because he kind of almost, in some ways, asks for it. But at a deeper level, you see that in no way was he really a fascist or anything close to that. And I'm emphasizing this because now I'm coming to a thinker, an Indian thinker, in fact, a Pune-based intellectual of the last century. In fact, he was born in the late 19th century. But of course, most of his books were written and published, etc., in the last century. In fact, the very first one came out about 102 years ago, Gita Bhashya, just 1 year after the publication of Tidak's Gita Rahasya. Now, and Rajwadi, I'm not going to go into that really, but because that's a different trajectory. But Rajwadi actually saw Nietzsche as an advocate of fascism, and became himself an advocate of fascism. Though I think Rajwadi's fascism was a rather brittle, second-hand and brittle kind of fascism, but still, I mean, he must have been one of the few thinkers, Indian thinkers, to have openly said, to have openly actually advocated fascism. And his source was Nietzsche. The philosophical justification he derived partly from Nietzsche, partly from his own kind of idiosyncratic interpretation of the Indian darshanik tradition. Anyway, so Now this S.R. Rajwade, of course, here the moment to mention Rajwade, people think of the other Rajwade, the historian, who was equally eccentric and when he was conservative and so on. These were the Brahmin intellectuals of that time in Pune. And but this is not the historian Rajwade that I'm talking about. And this one was actually the often known as better known as Ahitagni Rajwade, which is how he liked to be addressed actually, because he actually did keep the sacred fire going, and so that's and he was a very orthodox Brahmin, so that's what Ahitagni means here. So he was undoubtedly a very erudite, though idiosyncratic exegete and arch defender of the Hindu orthodoxy. I mean, he wrote about more than half a dozen books, and they are all exegetical. They're interpretative. They're commentaries, ostensibly commentaries. Actually, in the guise of exegesis, in the guise of a commentary, in fact, he puts across all kinds of different ideas of his own and so on. And the most bizarre of them, I think, is the Nasadiya Sukta Bhashya, which eventually becomes a treatise or a series of treatises on sexology and things like this. And this is something, had he been born in Bengal, by now we would have had about a dozen books on him. But because he was born here, there's hardly anything available on him and people hardly know about him. So anyway, so this was Rajwade. Now he kind of, he had received a pretty good education at Deccan College in those days. And he was also, of course, exposed to Western philosophy. His teacher was this British man who was a kind of a person, who had published books on philosophy, on Aristotle and things like this, a man called Bain. And yet somehow and that Bain was also a thoroughly conservative person. And this conservatism, of course, appealed to Rajwade. But he had never come across this name, even Nietzsche. So he discovers Nietzsche in Tilak's Gita Rahasya. And Tilak's Gita Rahasya is one of those wonders. I mean, if you look at the kind of rigor that it has and the kind of scholarly apparatus that it has, and there are references to philosophers like, of course, Schopenhauer, Kant, and even Nietzsche. I mean, imagine this was 1915, and I don't think there was much talk about Nietzsche in India at that time. But somehow Tilak seems to have, engaged with even Nietzsche in whatever way, and he lauds Nietzsche in a big way, because his Nietzsche, or his interpretation of Nietzsche, fits nicely into Tilak's advocacy of karma, emphasis on karma. And so he says that, well, here is a philosopher, European philosopher, who champions karma, action, contra Schopenhauer and other such advocates of akarma or renunciation. And he even says that it seems that now in Europe it is this cult of action or karma that is triumphing, and not the Schopenhauerian spirit of resignation and pessimism and so on and so forth. So this is where Rajwade discovered Nietzsche. And then, of course, he got hold of the then available complete works of Nietzsche in English translation. And Father Leatherley, who has produced a book which I think still remains unsurpassed, which is an intellectual history of modern Maharashtra, called Philosophical Trends in Modern Maharashtra, which he wrote when he was here in Pune actually. Father Leatherley, in fact, looked at this copy or rather they must have been volumes actually of Nietzsche's works that Rajwade used in his personal, which were still available in Rajwade's personal collection, though Rajwade was no more. And he says that you can see that he had read them very carefully and made notes there in the margins and so on and so forth. And Leatherley, who was himself, of course, a German, a person of German origin and trained in philosophy, theology, and so on. He says that Rajwade clearly understood, the spirit of Nietzsche. He had a clear, proper grasp of Nietzsche's philosophy. This is what Leatherley says. So he, after reading Nietzsche, he found him to be a kindred soul, and very interestingly, he published a Marathi translation of and commentary on Nietzsche's that slim volume, which will come up again in our discussion. That is the Antichrist, one of his Nietzsche's later works, published in 1895, though obviously it was written earlier because by then Nietzsche was actually, he had collapsed and he wasn't writing anything, etc. by 1895. But this book, Imagine, was translated in 1931 with a commentary. It's called Nietzscheचा Christantak. Actually, it goes like this: Nietzscheचा Christantak आणि Christantak Nietzsche. This is how it is titled, and it's an amazing translation. I think it's very. I also compared it with some more recent English translations of Nietzsche, and I think it really kind of matches in many ways. So this is a book that he wrote. Now, what is the place of Nietzsche in Rajwade's intellectual universe? Because what was Rajwade's intellectual project after all? The project was to shore up the traditional Hindu social order in the face of reformist attacks, and to reclaim what he saw as the essential message of the Vedas and the Gita from its later contamination, not only by Buddhism, but interestingly, by Shankaracharya. Okay, now this is a territory where I should tread, somebody like me should tread very carefully, because this, he develops a particular notion, which is the notion of, as opposed to the doctrine of Advaita, Rajwade develops the doctrine of Nirdvandva. Okay, and he critiques Shankaracharya as well, and he sees Shankaracharya's version and Shankaracharya's philosophy as a kind of perversion of really the real message of the Vedas and so on. So, of course, one has to also understand that Rajwade was basically a thinker who worked in the framework of Purva Mimamsa. So this is the other thing. Now, so he also criticized Shankaracharya because he thinks that, precisely as Nietzsche thought, Buddhism was in some ways life-denying, and he, of course, Nietzsche rejects asceticism, etc. And so also Rajwade thinks Shankaracharya also Shankaracharya's philosophy was a world-denying philosophy and emphasized asceticism, and etc. So that is what they have in common. Now Rajwade sought to fight this contagion, the contagion being Buddhist and Buddhism and Shankaracharya's philosophy, etc., by invoking Nietzsche's affirmation of the will to happiness, the will to power, and the will to suffer, and the allied conception of the overman. And Rajwade, of course, applauded Nietzsche's reverence, and Nietzsche openly has expressed his reverence, we know, notoriously, for the Manusmriti and for Varnashrama Dharma. Whatever Nietzsche's understanding of Varnashrama Dharma, but he clearly says it. As I said, you read him literally, and of course also because of his limited understanding of Indic traditions and Indic social reality, you find that he has, this is a fact, that Nietzsche has applauded Manusmriti, and there are positive references to Varnashrama Dharma. Now we come to a very different thinker, that is Babasaheb Ambedkar. He needs no introduction, of course. I will only say that the principle of polarity occupied a central place in the thought of Rajwade. And Babasaheb Ambedkar could be rightly described as a contemporary who was, a younger contemporary obviously, who was his polar opposite. I don't know if Dr. Ambedkar had ever heard about Rajwade. And in Rajwade's work, in fact, there aren't any very obvious references to Ambedkar, but that's not surprising. Because even some of the so-called progressive intellectuals of that generation hardly make any reference to Ambedkar. But take D.K. Bedekar, Marxist, one of the finest, perhaps the finest Marxist intellectual that Maharashtra has produced. I mean, of course, D.D. Kosambi is another story, but somebody writing in Marathi and so on, engaged in Marathi universe of discourse. But I don't think he doesn't mention Ambedkar, or Zavdekar doesn't mention Acharya Zavdekar, so doesn't mention really Ambedkar as far as I know in Adhunik Bharat and so on. So, but anyway, now of course we know that Ambedkar saw Buddhism as an antidote to the multifarious ills of Hinduism, And he, in that context, because he was an extremely widely read man, and he, in this text called Philosophy of Hinduism, Ambedkar's text, Philosophy of Hinduism, he clearly passes strictures on Nietzsche's admiration for Manu. That is only obvious. And in fact, I remember he says there that this book, Nietzsche's very famous book, Das Spake Zarathustra, is an updated edition of Manusmriti and things like that. And yet, and this shows you really the depth of Ambedkar's scholarship. He nevertheless, he admits, or rather, let's say his fair-mindedness. Ambedkar's fair-mindedness is evident in this kind of statement. And here I've actually verbatim, I've quoted this. He says in the same text, Philosophy of Hinduism, next page, he says, Nietzsche's supermen were supermen by reason of their worth, and Manu's supermen were supermen by reason of their birth. So given a choice, that he would definitely prefer Nietzsche to Manu, obviously. But going further, I've come across very interesting work done by young political theorist and historian of ideas, Aishwari Kumar, who in fact argues that the founder of Navayana, of course, meaning Dr. Ambedkar, and again I quote, was a Nietzschean, never shying away from virtuous war and never renouncing the ethical value of difference and sometimes competition amongst equals. So he, this is an essay published in Seminar Magazine 2013. It's worth reading. It's a bit complex, but this is the sort of argument that he makes. I think it is also, of course, something to do with the fact that these very young, bright Indian scholars are located in, most of the time they are in, that's how they can produce this kind of work. They're not in some state university here, but they are always on the move, and they are moving in circles where these are thinkers that are au courant, Nietzsche, etc. And so you have, even if there is a Nietzschean interpretation of Gandhi that I've come across, and so here is an kind of almost Nietzschean interpretation of Ambedkar. But still, it's something worth looking at. But what I found more interesting was in a book called Recovering Liberties, the eminent historian Chris Bailey, he has pointed out a kind of resemblance between Nietzsche and Ambedkar at another level. That is to say, he argues that there is, he focuses on, he zeroes in on and highlights what he calls parallel historicist arguments about the origin of servility in religious belief. In the case of Nietzsche, it is Christianity, of course, which he considers to be a religion that created a kind of a slave morality as opposed to the sort of master morality that he was advocating. And in the case of Dr. Ambedkar, of course, it was Hinduism. And he says in both cases there is, in fact, the term Chris Bailey uses is abuse of scripture. That is to say, I would say, rephrase it and say severe criticism of scripture. In the case of Ambedkar, it is the Gita, etc. And in the case of Nietzsche, it would be the Bible. So this is another kind of, I thought, rather interesting sort of way of looking at the Nietzsche Ambedkar sort of nexus. And now, as I said, this is a bit tricky territory. That is what I'm calling the moral psychology of Buddhism, and I use this term to connote the distinctive patterns of motivation and emotional response involved in the internalization and practicing of moral standards. Right. So that is to say, when we, especially in the classroom kind of situation, in philosophy classrooms and so on, when we study ethics, and these are generally dry as dust ideas, and we approach them the way we approach ideas in other fields, right? But morality, after all, the kind of values, principles, etc., that are embodied in morality, are actually meaningless unless they're put into practice. And therefore, I think this is one of the reasons why these branches of philosophy are called practical philosophy. And there is some sort of there are very interesting sorts of psychological processes. So, and that's where I think psychology, sociology, etc. come in. When you look at morality in that larger context, okay? It's lived morality. And so I'm trying to kind of figure out what would be the appeal, moral psychological appeal of Buddhism. And about this, there are some interesting observations that have been made by scholars about Buddhism and its appeal across epochs. So one of them is, of course, Damodar Dhammanand Kosambi himself, and there are other like-minded historians like B.G. Gokhale. They have pointed out the really very healthy influence of early Buddhism, which facilitated. Gokhale particularly emphasizes this point, that that early Buddhism facilitated an urban revolution in the Gangetic region, and it addressed the moral needs of new mercantile and governing classes by promoting a non-metaphysical and non-ritualistic kind of a spiritual culture, unlike the one preceding it. And so clearly, I mean, when a particular religion acquires certain kind of a social base and social support, there are various things going on there. It is obviously catering to different kinds of needs, and so one does not have to be a reductionist to understand, this sort of a relation, this dialectic. Okay. Now Nietzsche himself, if you look at Nietzsche's, especially Nietzsche's remarks on Buddhism in the Antichrist. The Antichrist, there are some very interesting kinds of observations that Nietzsche makes about Buddhism. And where, interestingly, of course, as I said, he does, in the last analysis, consider Buddhism to be nihilistic, decadent, and so on. And yet he says that it is vastly superior to, for example, to Christianity. Nietzsche very clearly says that. And he extols Buddhism there because it eschews the idea of God and ressentiment, and it does not advocate prayer or asceticism, but it upholds a kind of phenomenalism which is geared to the elimination of suffering, and it ensues in an ethic that is beyond good and evil. This is virtually a paraphrase of Nietzsche. I am not attributing anything to Nietzsche because this is again tricky territory. So this is a fairly honest, accurate paraphrase of Nietzsche. Nietzsche himself says that the Buddhist ethic is beyond good and evil, and it is most unlike this sort of the Christian spirit of ressentiment and the sort of Christian Puritanism and so on and so forth. And he thinks that Buddhism is far superior there. And he then also, Nietzsche, praises the Buddhist recipe for spiritual hygiene. The term hygiene occurs there. And he calls actually the Buddha a sort of a physiologist. And he says, what is that Buddhist recipe for spiritual hygiene? Living out in the open, the wandering life, moderation and a careful diet, a calm state of mind, and the pursuit of benevolence. So, sorry, I didn't change this. Okay, so that is what Nietzsche says actually in favor of Buddhism. And now actually I want to present to you some of his, actually couple of quotations. I think that is where you can clearly see what, how he actually, in what kind of perspective he puts Buddhism. These are actual verbatim quotations. He says in the Antichrist, Buddhism presupposes a very mild climate, extremely gentle and liberal customs. The complete absence, the emphasis is in the original, the complete absence of militarism and the existence of higher, even scholarly classes to give focus to the movement. Then he says Buddhism is a religion for mature people, again emphasis in the original. For kindly, gentle races that have become excessively spiritual and are too sensitive to pain. leads these races back to peace and cheerfulness, to a spiritual diet, to a certain physical fortification. It's a religion for the end and exhaustion of civilization. Now, this, of course, we know that this understanding of Buddhism is not really historically very accurate, actually. Nietzsche's understood this sort of sociological understanding of Buddhism, or the moral psychology of Buddhism, is historically not terribly accurate. And yet, why am I presenting this to you? My own kind of hunch is, and my guess is, that some of these kinds of traits that he is highlighting, that create a temperament that would be hospitable to the reception of Buddhism. Now, if you were to think of individuals, or perhaps some social groups or individuals, rather than entire an entire society, then I think this explains to a considerable extent, I think, the appeal of Buddhism to a certain set of people, right, who have these individually these traits. What he calls these mature people, who are kindly, gentle, spiritual, and so on. Okay, and so for them, this is a good kind of a spiritual diet. This is sort of feeling that I have. That is to say, especially if you look at the appeal of Buddhism and now Vipassana, etc., to a certain set of otherwise, very sophisticated people who would otherwise not have much time for religion, etc., of the traditional kind, religious practices, beliefs, and so on, rituals of the traditional kind. But they have a great passion for Buddhism, particular type of Buddhism. Okay, so this here in India, and also, of course, abroad in the West. Right? So this attraction of Buddhism, even to way back, actually, to somebody like Russell at another level. Bertrand Russell, in his History of Western Philosophy, he counterposes, in fact, Buddha and Nietzsche. But anyway, Russell, I don't think ever was practicing Buddhist, or that he even tried. But this was essentially cerebral, a certain kind of cerebral preference for the kind of Buddhist ethics as opposed to Nietzschean ethics. But I think this Nietzsche has cottoned on to something that is relevant to the moral psychology of the that helps us to decipher the moral psychology of a certain set of people who are now attracted to Buddhism. And so finally, now just the last few remarks. Now, if you look at the history of ideas, where there is some kind of where an attempt is made to bring Buddhism and Nietzsche within the same compass, then you find argument which project the Buddha and Nietzsche as proponents of competing philosophies or complementary philosophies. So they are, as I just said, Russell clearly over a few pages actually sort of discusses them as very, very competing philosophies, and he actually says that I greatly prefer the teachings of the Buddha, but there is no way I can definitively refute Nietzsche. Okay, because remember, he was a philosopher in the analytical tradition, and to him these are, after all, matters where beyond a point nothing can be rigorously approved or established. So this is one way. But there are many, many scholars who have also pointed out, as Ellman himself, who I referred to, areas of significant convergence. And there are, in fact, one of these scholars I've cited here, these scholars argue that had Nietzsche had kind of a better access to good, authentic kind of Buddhist literature, and had he actually been hermeneutically more attentive, etc., then he would have almost kind of become a Buddhist, or that he would have found far greater convergence between his own ideas and Buddhist ideas. So this is all very fine. But my point is, I feel that in a kind of almost Nietzschean or even a Buddhist spirit, I would say, remember the reference to perspectivism, I would say that any such comparative exercise would largely depend on the framework deployed. And I think at the end of the day, there remains a difference between the soteriological and secular orientations of these two different modes of thought. And Buddhism, all said and done, is soteriological, which is, I think, philosophers, I'm sorry for using this word, which is what philosophers have taught me. That is, soteriological, as many of you would know, is something that has to do with the pursuit of salvation and so on. Okay, whereas Nietzschean philosophy is utterly worldly. Okay, so, I mean, we know, of course, that in Buddha there's no metaphysics and so on, and there's no very easy notion of transcendence, etc. And Buddhism is also worldly in certain ways, no doubt. And that's one of the major reasons why Dr. Ambedkar was attracted towards it. And yet we know that the problems that, traditional Buddhist, the clergy and, traditional Buddhist scholars have had with Navayana, because it's very difficult to reconcile this original kind of soteriological impulse and the sort of scientific garb in which somebody like Dr. Ambedkar tries to put Buddhism. So I think that difference remains, and so perhaps it would be best to admit and learn from the productive tension between these two worldviews, rather than come to some hasty conclusion as to their inherent antagonism or some kind of an inherent harmony. So this is where I end. Thank you. I believe in the memorial lecture, the protocol is that there are no questions actually. But if you like, I would adopt a kind of a Buddhist middle path and welcomes comments and so on. If you have some suggestions for me or comments for me, then I would take them. And if you have the patience still left, and unless I am so greatly provoked by what you say that I feel compelled to respond, otherwise I'll just, I would like to hear from you, essentially. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kulkarni. I extend my heartfelt gratitude towards him for this enlightening lecture, and I request Professor Bahulkar to felicitate Professor Kulkarni. Thank you, sir. Thanks are also due to Dr. Vijay Bedekar and his team in Thane for the live streaming of this program through internet. I must also thank our staff, Bhandarkar staff, for this quick arrangement due to the change in venue. I must also thank them. I thank media for the timely publicity, and I also thank all of you for this overwhelming response and for forcing us to change the venue. And I hope to see you all again for our next program. Thank you all, and I declare that the lecture and the function is over. Thank you.